However, the future of British Steel is still in question, because we know that the Turkish military pension fund at one stage was interested in acquiring British Steel and continuing with it. We know that's fallen away recently, but as reported in the Financial Times only 4 days ago, there is a renewed interest from a Chinese group to take it over. So the future is still in the balance for that company. But irrespective of that, our argument at the committee was that we weren't just considering British Steel, we were considering steel making in the UK and in Europe, and indeed that was predicated on those assumptions in our paper. There are a lot of other companies that make steel in Britain. There's Salsa and Tata, to name two others. There are a lot of companies in Europe that make steel, and currently those companies import large-scale coking coal from the USA and elsewhere. So in our opinion, whilst we understand why this has come to us as an issue, and it did happen after March, it's not of such significance that it would warrant a different recommendation this time. The second matter is the amendment to the Climate Change Act 2008, which occurred in June 2019. And this increased the reduction of over 1990 levels of carbon dioxide into the air from 80% target to 100% target. So obviously it's an acceleration of the target. And the accusation here is that we didn't take that into account because it only occurred in June 2019, and it is of such significance that you would have taken a different decision to the one you took in March. Again, in our view, it isn't substantiated. The report you had in front of you in March did take into account the Climate Change Act. The fact that it's accelerated from 80% to 100% is not so significant in our eyes as to warrant a different recommendation this time.
Quiet, please.
We're moving on to the alleged flaws in decision making by failing to take into account greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this is a significant one. I think from reading through the Lee letter and associated letters of objection, it's quite clear that the campaign groups who are here in force, and I respect their views, etc., and who could ignore climate changes in the news every day.
Sorry, are members of the public allowed to record? Thank you.
So I've lost my track a little bit, but it's the view of the objectors and Lee is ostensibly that we didn't take into account greenhouse gas emissions emanating from this plant, and that we should have done. Our view is that it wasn't necessary to do it, and that's because we rely on the basically supply and demand laws of economics to do so. Our argument all along has been that this proposal would substitute for the current greenhouse gases which emanate from the existing setups that we have. We import, as I said before, lots of coal from from America and elsewhere at great cost. This coking coal, which West Cumbria might generate, would arguably be much more competitive because it's closer to the actual steel producers than the American coal or Australian coal. And because of that being more competitive, it's likely that the steel makers themselves would turn to West Cumbria mining to place orders at the expense of those coking plants in America. And as a result, we felt it would be a carbon neutral balance because those plants in America were likely to reduce their supply of coal, and as a result of that, would reduce their CO2 emissions. And eventually what you would end up is a balancing act between what's happening with West Cumbria in the UK and what's happening in America in terms of the CO2 emissions. There might be some advantages as well, because you don't have the transport costs involved in taking coking coal 7,000 kilometres across the Atlantic Ocean to get here. So that was the premise of our argument, and remains the premise of our argument, and we believe that we did take into account fairly the issue to do with greenhouse gases. To a certain extent, that argument also applies to the next two items on the agenda, which are covered on the page rather, which are covered by the addendum report. Midlands Coal was a little bit difficult. We decided that it would be appropriate for Midlands Coal to try and find a market, which might be difficult for them, but it was possible. It was coming out of the ground anyway, alongside the metallurgical coal, and the alternative was to push it back into the ground, separating from the metallurgical coal. We thought there may be a market for it. It's restricted to 15% of total output. That market might be substitutions for concrete making, etc., as a fuel source. We felt that regulatory controls are likely to contain that, the greenhouse gas emissions from the use of Midlands coal, and we didn't think, because of the quantities, that it was appropriate to try and identify the end use of every single piece of Midlands coal which might come out of the ground. It was unreasonable for us to do so. The third point about the increase in coal production, I think, has been covered off adequately in the report, and the last point relates to a view that we did not quote policy ENV2 from the adopted Copeland local plan, and because of that our decision was suspect. Again, we don't believe that's true, because policy ENV2 deals with the historic environment, and quite clearly in our report we did cover the historic environment and its impacts. Indeed, we did find that there would be some harm caused as a result of that. There's plenty of case law to suggest that is an adequate response and would cover us off if this went to judicial review on that matter. So I'm completely satisfied in relation to that particular issue itself. Just moving on then. So, just to conclude really, the events that have happened since March are not, in our opinion, so significant as to warrant a different recommendation this time. We do not accept that we failed to consider greenhouse gas emissions in our committee report. There's been no policy change to the National Planning Policy Framework, which would recommend you look at this again. There has been no change to your local plan policies, which would recommend you look at this again. There has been no change to the site. There has been no change to developments in proximity to the site, which might warrant another look at this matter again. The only thing I can find in addition to what's been said is a matter that's been mentioned by a couple of objectors, is that the government have brought out a paper relating to this Clean Steel Fund, which is an announcement that it's basically calling for evidence about how we attempt to decarbonise the steel industry in the light of the 100% target for emissions. It is a call for evidence, it's not policy. So basically the government are asking, how are we going to achieve the 100% reduction? And it's asking people like yourselves, like the industry and other campaign groups, how we do it, how can we do it to achieve that target. So it's a consideration for you, but it's not, in our view anyway, so significant that again it would warrant a change in your recommendation. This is just a reminder, Chair, we've now got 56 objections as a result of at 10:15 this morning. Many raising the same points about greenhouse gas emissions, and they're covered off in the update sheet that you've got. But over the 3 rounds of consultations, we had roughly something in the region of 75 to 80% support for this application, and around 20 to 25% against it. That was through the 3 rounds of public participation. I also wanted to just remind you that before we took the decision in March, none of the current statutory consultees actually raised an objection to this application. From Natural England to the Environment Agency, from our own landscape architects to highways, from the Coal Authority to district parish councils to Network Rail, the historic environment, to rights of way, none raised an objection. They did make comments and requested conditions which have found their way into our committee report. So Chairman, I think I understand the concern about greenhouse gas emissions. I feel very uncomfortable about it at a personal level. But professionally, you have to make a judgment in accordance with your development plan and the government's policy itself. And that has remained unchanged. And that's the way you must make that decision. There is an opportunity, of course, that you may weigh the concerns about greenhouse gases as being so significant that it overtakes that policy, but that is a decision that's in your hands. Our recommendation remains as it is to approve the scheme. Thank you, Chair.
Shame.